Good afternoon. My name is Anna Geraldo Kerr, and I'm the Vice Chair of the Board of Trustees at the Needham Free Public Library. It is my honor to welcome you this afternoon to learn about Needham's history. We have two great speakers this afternoon. I've been working with them and learning from them. And although I know that this presentation has been partially been available in the past, I think you're in for a treat because there's new information. And there's also, we're also encouraging this discussion to talk about what Needham's present and future will be. So without further ado, I present to you Reverend Catie Scudera.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Anna, for the introduction and for the invitation to share our work on the history of enslavement in Needham. I'm also very grateful for all of you who have dialed into this McIver lecture today. I know we're all a little bit zoomed out, so thank you for getting in front of a screen again to participate in the challenging work of reckoning with a difficult history. I'd like to begin by sharing with you how Dr. Greis and I got started investigating the history of enslavement in Needham. In 2017, the Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism, or BLUE, organizing collaborative challenged Unitarian Universalist congregations to reflect on how white supremacy culture lives in our institutions. One request the organizers had for us was to research the history of Black membership in our congregations and Black residency in our local areas. As my congregation, First Parish, prepared for this white supremacy teach-in, I dutifully typed into Google Needham slavery. I spent my childhood in a different commonwealth, Virginia, and fully expected I would find no results to that search, unlike how it was in my home commonwealth. But instead, thanks to Blue and to Google, I began to pull on a thread about slavery in Needham that unraveled my personal assumption that slavery didn't happen here in our small, poor New England farming town. What Google showed me was the history of Needham, Massachusetts, 1711 to 1911, a 200th anniversary history of our town written by a member of my congregation at the time, George Kuhn Clark. I have a physical copy given to me by a parishioner when I arrived in Needham in 2014. What I had never noticed before was that the book contains a chapter on slaves in Needham, as you see here. Now, it would have been easy for me to miss in my paper copy because that chapter's pages in my copy are unopened, which means that the binder did not perform the cut to allow the pages to be opened and read. If you can't read the text on your screen, allow me to give you the highlights. It says, the institution of human slavery never flourished in Needham, but a few Blacks were held in bondage here, as the church records and inventories of estates testify. At the time of the War of the American Revolution, Captain William Ferris, a loyalist, and William Bowden, Esquire, were the only slaveholders in town and were each taxed for one slave. Though the late Horace Mann stated that he found the names of 4 slaves of Captain Ferris, Jack, who went to England in 1779, Sylvia, who was sold to Sir Henry Franklin, Terrace, who died of smallpox, and Phoebe, who was supported by the Ferris family in her old age. In 1775, 2 Negro children belonging to Captain William Ferris, named Prince and Sylvia, were baptized by the minister of the First Church, which is my church. I was honestly shocked, though I should not have been. I was simply ignorant, perhaps willfully so, about the enslavement history of Massachusetts. It's not like I had never passed the Boston Women's Memorial on Commonwealth Avenue. In fact, I used to serve a congregation, Unitarian Universalist congregation, just around the corner, the Arlington Street Church, and was always delighted to see fellow Unitarians, Abigail Adams and Lucy Stone, featured in the monument. And you can see in this photograph on the right side, a third remarkable woman of early Massachusetts history, poet Phyllis Wheatley, who was taken from her home in West Africa and enslaved in Boston before she became the first published author of African descent in the colonies. Now, after Google showed me these hidden to me pages of Clark's 1911 history, our First Parish Archives team got right on figuring out whether Captain Ferris or William Bowden were members of our congregation, and they were not. Ferris was even a member of the Anglican congregation over in Cambridge, and I honestly felt a great bit of relief about that, a feeling that would not stay. I also spoke with other local Unitarian Universalist ministers who had engaged in research on New England enslavement history. Reverend David Catie, my colleague of blessed memory, who not only uncovered genealogical evidence that his own ancestors had been New England enslavers, but he put in the work to meet the descendants of the man his ancestors had enslaved. And I spoke with Reverends Janet Parsons and Susan Moran, ministers of the UU congregations in Gloucester and Rockport, whose congregations sponsored research and publication of the enslavement history of Cape Ann. I was pointed to the few published works on New England enslavement and learned that both indigenous peoples and people of African descent were enslaved widely in this part of the European colonies. And I realized quickly that I needed real expert help to understand enslavement here in Needham specifically. So leaders in my congregation and I met with Dr. Gloria Greis of the Needham History Center. And Gloria, I'll pass it on to you now.
Thank you, Reverend Catie. Before I start, I have a few thank yous as well. I would like to thank Town Clerk Teddy Eaton and Town Treasurer Evelyn Ponis for their help with researching the town records. Susan Anderson for searching the New England Historical Genealogical Society's library for Clark's transcriptions of the parish registers. Cliff Hayden and Kim Marie Nichols for their generous donation in support of this research. And of course, the trustees of the Needham Free Public Library for sponsoring this important community discussion. As Reverend Catie said, she and I and others have been working on this topic for a couple of years now. In March 2019, when I was first asked to address enslavement in Needham for the First Parish's Lane Lyceum, I observed that we, as residents of Massachusetts, were used to being on the right side of history. The Revolutionary War started here. We fought for the Union. And from emancipation to labor rights to civil rights to reproductive rights to marriage rights, our state has always been in the forefront of the fights for empowerment and freedom. So we are not happy when we discover that we were sometimes not on the side of right and justice. Sometimes we were not the good guys that we think we are. The fact is that Massachusetts was deeply involved in the enslavement of African people, and even our own town of Needham was not without complicity. This might shake us a little out of our complacency and even shock us, but really, the evidence was always there for us to see if we would only look. Before I go into this, I would like to make two comments on terminology. The first is that we will be using the terms enslaved person and enslaver whenever possible, in preference to the more familiar slave and slave owner. This may seem like a nitpicky point, but language is not neutral. The word slave has become almost value-free. We use the word carelessly. I slaved over a hot stove, or my boss is a slave driver. Well, no. My work, which I chose, is well compensated, and I used part of that income to invest in a comfortable kitchen where I pursue a hobby which I enjoy. These are not tasks that were forcibly compelled under threat of violence. Enslaver and enslaved put these roles in their proper perspective. An enslaved person lacks agency and is not complicit in his oppression. An enslaver uses force, isolation, and violence to compel unwilling and uncompensated labor. We should not use language that mitigates this. The second is the term servant. Whether a field hand or a Downton Abbey housekeeper, a servant in our terminology is a person who is paid to do a task. This is not the case in colonial America, where the terms servant and slave were interchangeable and the word slave was in fact rarely used. This is not them trying to hide anything, because it was not something they were trying to hide. It was the way current usage was. So when we see the term servant or Negro servant, we are tempted to assume that these were paid staff rather than enslaved people. So there are two ways to tell the difference. Paid servants, both whites and free blacks, had last names. They had a lineage. Also, their first names are usually biblical names. From Abimelech to Zechariah, their names could be found in the Testaments. Enslaved people had only one name, a deliberate distinction that severed them from family relationships. Their names are often taken from classical literature and history, like Nero, Cato, and Pompey, or from the natural world, Violet and Petunia. And there are just a couple things I want to point out in this slide. The top one, I put a red dot next to Jonathan Kinch, servant of Josiah Woodward. Jonathan Kinch is a white man. He is a paid servant. He's probably actually an apprentice of Josiah Woodward. The second slip there, April 9th, 1754, my Negro servant Homer died. And the two tells there are Negro servant as opposed to servant and Homer. No further name. Classical name, no last name. If you look at the third one down, I put a dot next to Betty, daughter of Cromwell Oliver. Cromwell Oliver was an African man. He was a free man, and that is that's just designated by fact he has a last name, but also Clark or Reverend Townsend makes the distinction of actually noting Ethiopian next to his name. So he designates the fact that he is black, but also that he is a free man and not a slave. If you look sort of a couple lines up, a Negro child belonging to Mrs. Deming, its name was Rose. And actually a few lines above that, Thomas Kinch, who is the father of Jonathan Kinch. When Thomas died, Jonathan was actually a small boy and went into service, and when he himself died, he was about 18. But you can see the way these things are listed, they make obvious distinctions between the status of the people involved. As I said, Massachusetts' involvement in slavery has never been a secret. What school child has not heard of the triangle trade? Enslavement came to Massachusetts with the first settlers. The slave trade, first in Native Americans and then in Africans, arose soon after. Boston was one of the colony's principal ports and dominated the colonial trade in all kinds of goods. By the end of the 18th century, Boston merchants controlled the direct importing of Africans into slavery. Most were sold into the West Indies, but those who deemed too weak to endure the harsh West Indian conditions were sold in New England. The numbers grew rapidly. In 1876, there were approximately 200 enslaved Africans in Massachusetts. In 1708, the number had grown to about 550, and by 1715 to 2,000. It is estimated that in the 1750s, enslaved Africans made up over 2% of the Massachusetts population and more than 10% of the population of Boston. Puritan theology, the theology of 18th century Needham and its only church, the First Parish, did not clash with the notion of enslavement. In fact, it supported it. Slaveholding was attested in the Old Testament, and the wretched position of slaves was proof that those individuals were not numbered among God's elect. African blacks were the accursed descendants of Ham, son of Noah, who were cast out to be the servants of servants. This was codified in Massachusetts law in 1641, setting the rules for slaveholding, quote, which the law of God established in Israel concerning such people doth morally require. So what about Needham? How does this involve us? As Reverend Catie noted, in George Kuhn Clark's History of Needham, Massachusetts, there's a page entitled Slaves, on which he notes that at the time of the War of the American Revolution, Captain William Ferris and William Bowden were the only slaveholders in town and were each taxed for one slave. I want to look a little more closely at Clark's statement, at the time of the War of the American Revolution, Captain William Ferris, etc. This is only a partial truth. Maybe only two in 1780, but parish records from earlier, the 1750s, show that there were quite a few more than two. Here are the numbers that we have so far, which are by no means complete. And these were the families and the individuals we were able to identify at this point. William Ferris was English or Irish. He was a loyalist who enjoyed tweaking his neighbors as traitors. He moved to Needham from Cambridge in 1761 and died here in 1789. He served as Justice of the Peace from 1775 to 1789. So even though he gave his neighbors a hard time, they actually did not dislike him all that much. William Bowden was Needham's representative in general court from 1752 to 1755. He was apparently well enough off that he could donate his rep salary to the town for the support of the schools. Sergeant, later Captain Jonathan Gay, was an officer in the Needham's East Militia Company during the Revolutionary War. He also served as selectman and town clerk. And of course, the Reverend Jonathan Townsend, who was the first minister in the first parish from 1720 to 1762. And Reverend Catie, I'm going to pass this back to you for some words on your predecessor, Reverend Townsend.
Thank you. I very much did not want Reverend Townsend, our founding pastor and longest serving pastor, to be an enslaver. I very much wanted that to be a mistake in the historical record. I went as far as to contact a research librarian, also Gloria Korsman, and my alma mater, Harvard Divinity School, to see what she could unearth about Townsend, who is also a graduate of Harvard. She confirmed that which I did not wish to be true. In a biographical volume of Harvard College graduates, it states that Reverend Townsend's father-in-law, Captain Gregory Sugars, provided the means for building the Pleasant Parsonage, which still stands at the corner of Nahoyden Street and Central Avenue, streets that may be familiar to all of you. Perhaps from the same source came the minister's slave, Homer, who for periods served the parish as sexton. This was particularly horrifying to me, that the man enslaved by the founding pastor of my congregation had been forced to clean and maintain the church building. Going back to George Kuhn Clark's history, I was able to find that it says, on June 5th, 1754, the Reverend Mr. Townsend was granted £1, 1 shilling, 4 pence for his servants taking care of the meeting house in 1753. This was probably the Negro Homer, who died April 9th, 1754. Before passing back to Dr. Greis, I'll also note that the Harvard biography states that 1 month after Homer's death, at the May town meeting, yes, we've been having town meetings in May for quite a while, Reverend Townsend threatened to resign unless he received better pay and reliable currency. I wonder if Townsend could only manage serving First Parish as long as he did because he held an enslaved person in his home. And I wonder if our first meeting house would have stood as long as it did if it had not been for Homer's unpaid labor. Furthermore, 2 other enslavers on the list that Dr. Greis showed us, the Tolmans and the Gays, were founding families of Needham and of First Parish, and it is deeply upsetting that they enslaved children. Now back to you, Gloria.
Thank you. So this list that I made comes from the First Parish Register, specifically the births and deaths between 1750 and 1762 that were recorded by Reverend Townsend. In other words, these are the enslaved people that we know of because they happened to be born or died, and most of whom belonged to First Parish members in this period. We could then assume that there were others as well because not every birth and death was registered in the parish, and because this particular list only covers the 1750s, so there are many years unaccounted for. More interesting is that Clark does not mention any of this in his account of slavery in Needham. Clark's history is 900 pages long and excruciating in its detail. Yet this is a detail that he does not include. Did he even know about them? Well, yes, he did, because the parish lists that I took these from were published in the New England Historical and Genealogical Register in articles written by George Kuhn Clark. So why was Clark so reticent to discuss slaveholding in Needham? For all his precision, Clark could be evasive when it came to controversy. After all, his family had lived here for several generations, and he was writing a history on behalf of people who had lived here far longer, and all of whom he knew personally. And he was certainly not going to tarnish the reputation of the Reverend Mr. Townsend, first minister of the parish of which he was a member. Because this view was so partial, the next task became to find more comprehensive and detailed records that might give us a better handle on the numbers of enslaved people in Needham. We had several questions that we wanted to answer. How many enslaved people were there in Needham during this period? And this period we're looking at right now is the 1750s, but ultimately we want to look at the whole scope of Needham's townhood from 1711 through the abolition of slavery in Massachusetts in 1783. How many families in Needham were enslavers? How were enslaved people acquired in 18th century Needham? And finally, what happened to them after they were emancipated in 1783? Ultimately, this was easier said than done. The ideal source of information would be annual personal property tax records. Enslaved people were considered real property, just like the house, the tools, and the livestock. I was hoping that an enumeration of the tax records would show which families were taxed for slaves. This would enable us to see who was living and where, rather than just a snapshot of people who died between 1749 and 1762. However, despite a search by Town Clerk Teddy Eaton and Town Treasurer Evelyn Ponis, we were not able to locate such a record for the mid-18th century. It was not in the selectmen's books, nor was it in the treasurer's records, which in those days reported the receipts in the aggregate. Clark's information about Captain Ferris and William Bowden was not, it turns out, from a systematic town record, but from a later source that mentioned a receipt. So we still have yet to find this particular source of information. Next best were the records of the probate court where wills were filed. As property, enslaved people would have to be included in the probate inventory as a valuable asset. The example in the illustration is not from Needham. It is the inventory of wealthy Boston merchant Isaac Royal, listing 9 enslaved men and 4 women. I'm sorry that the detail is a little bit over enlarged, but you can see 9 Negro men named Fortune, Baron Peter, et cetera, and 4 Negro women in this list, valued at roughly 100 pounds a person. The Royal House and Slave Quarters is now a museum in Medford and an excellent resource on enslavement in colonial Massachusetts. It's actually the last surviving slave quarters in the Northeast. And they reoriented their narrative and mission over the last several years to focus on enslavement and the role of the Boston merchants in enslavement in Massachusetts. The probate files are actually quite accessible because the Latter-day Saints have digitized the entire archive of the Massachusetts probate courts back to 1636 and put them online in their family search site. I spent many, many hours. This is an amazing resource. It's been cross-referenced by name, date, and docket. So if you have a name and a year of death, you should be good to go. So you find a last name, you find a first name, you match it up to the year, you go to the docket number, which is that number at the end. The docket tells you what's in the records, and 12112, Jacob Mills of Needham, who died in 1789. We have his bond, the instruction letter, his inventory, and this is basically it's all the paperwork involved with the probating of his estate. Of course, it's never all that easy. I cross-checked all of the names on the list we had from Clark, but most did not have probated inventories. William Ferris did, but he died in 1789 after the abolition of slavery in Massachusetts. Jonathan Gay, who died in 1761, also had an inventory and probate, but his will fell into the one section, literally out of hundreds of thousands of pages that were missing from the database. I have asked him for a new scan, but that will be a little while in coming. And failing that, I looked through the published probate inventories identified for Needham from the years 1740 through 1760, roughly 75 in all. I chose those years because they corresponded roughly to the years for which we have the parish register notes. None of them listed an enslaved person. Other information. In 1775, the governor ordered a census of all enslaved people in Massachusetts over the age of 16. Needham reports 1 male. That was the year after Homer, the Reverend Mr. Townsend's slave, had died. So presumably, there was another enslaved adult male in Needham. Clark mentions that in the 1765 Needham census, which lists 168 families and 945 individuals, 14 of whom were enslaved people. And in 1777, Josiah Upman was paid £7 by the town for enlisting his enslaved man into the Continental Army. So those are just random details, but little bits of information that we've also been able to collect. So of the questions we asked at the beginning, what have we learned? First, that there were enslavers in Needham, at least 9 families and at least 15 individuals that we can count. And we know there had to be more adults, but otherwise we don't yet know where the gaps are in our knowledge. That the great majority of enslaved people seem to be children, based on the birth and death registers and the discrepancy between the number of enslaved people known from the parish register and the number reported to the governor. 6 of the individuals in my list were born into slavery, so were therefore born to enslaved adults for whom we have no other record right now. And little Rose, who I pointed out on that previous list, was 10 months old when she died. So clearly she had not been purchased for service. She was useless as a laborer at that age, obviously. She was born to another enslaved person. So we know that there are these adults that we don't have good records for yet. And what happened after 1783? There's very little record of this. Captain Ferris's Jack was sent to England in 1779, possibly transferred to one of Ferris's other properties to avoid the loss. Sylvia was sold to someone else. Ferris is said to have supported Phoebe into her old age, but she comes into the poorhouse in 1789, the year Ferris died. So his sons apparently did not continue that support. And finally, we can conclude that although enslavement was a fact of life in Needham, it was also not widespread or extensive, as seen by the number of probate inventories that do not include enslaved people. Based on Isaac Royal's inventory, it would cost around £100 to purchase a slave, and very few Needham residents had that kind of cash. Our knowledge is better, but it's not complete. There's still more probate inventories to read for the years 1711 through 1740 and 1760 through 1783. We might still find the taxation lists in one of the archives repositories. I will finish this section with one observation. It is easy to fault historians like Clark for looking away from these difficult questions, but it also becomes increasingly clear to me that this information is not easy to find, and it's visible only when you look for it intentionally. We need to ask these more explicit questions and search out their data, and not just assume that the full narratives are there waiting for us to read them. Although enslavement was abolished in Massachusetts in 1783, the benefits to the state's economy from slave trading lasted much longer. The federal government outlawed the slave trade on American shipping in 1794 and outlawed the importation of enslaved Africans into the United States in 1807. Nevertheless, means were found, smuggling, transfers from neutral ports, falsified manifests, and the trade continued well into the 19th century. New England merchants continued to be an important part of this trade, carrying slaves from Africa, transporting slave-grown cotton to world markets, or carrying the grain and supplies needed to the South. Even the economies not directly participating in the slave trade were deeply involved. It is hard to overestimate how deeply the U.S. economy was dependent upon enslaved labor in the 19th century. Our foreign trade was based on slave-produced raw materials. Our agricultural produce fed the South. The Industrial Revolution of the northern states, first and strongest here in Massachusetts, grew up over the textile industry. From the huge hydro-powered looms of Lowell and the Merrimack Valley to the smaller steam-powered looms of Needham, Massachusetts' growing textile industry depended upon the supply of cotton, slave-grown cotton, from the southern states. Needham in the 19th century was beginning to partake of this industrial economy. In the 1840s, the Ellis's cotton mill, which is now located where the Echo Bridge Mall is, made Osnaburg, a cheap and durable cotton duck cloth that was used for slave clothes for the southern market. In the mid-19th century, as the textile industry in England industrialized, hand loom knitters losing their livelihoods began to emigrate, and many came to this region. In Needham, most settled in Highlandville, now known as Needham Heights, because the land in Highlandville was open. There had been a long history of mills and industry in the Upper Falls. Through the 1850s and 60s, numerous knitters settled in the Heights. most working their hand looms as a cottage industry, making small goods like gloves. There were several larger shops, and there were 6 or 8 large-scale factories, the most famous of which was the William Carter Company. The mills, especially the large mills, became the mainstays of Needham's economic growth in the later years of the 19th century. As farming began to decline, much of the cash coming into town was coming through the mills. The mills also absorbed the immigrant labor that started coming here during that period, Irish fleeing the famine, and then Italians, Russians, and Poles fleeing the political upheavals of their own countries. The mills, which knitted wool and cotton into sweaters, union suits, underwear, baby clothes, and other garments, provided a good wage and, for the time, fairly progressive employment conditions. But I doubt any of them stopped to think where the cotton came from. Reverend Catie.
And we don't quite have time today to go into too much detail of the legacies of Northern anti-Black racism in the 20th century, but much of that is expressed through housing inequities and the mass incarceration of Black and brown people. Mass incarceration is tied to police brutality, racial profiling, and broken windows, stop and frisk style policies, and housing inequities are connected with educational inequities, such as the inequitable enactment of the GI Bill. Another example is what you see here, the residential security map of Needham itself, part of the legal and discriminatory mortgage lending practices prior to the 1970s. These maps created and maintained economic and racial segregation. In 1938, when this map was created, Needham actually didn't have any green type A desirable neighborhoods. We likely weren't affluent enough, close enough to the city, even though we were nearly entirely white. Instead, we see some type B blue neighborhoods that were deemed still desirable, some yellow type C declining neighborhoods, and then red type D risky neighborhoods. In Needham, European Catholic immigrants and Jewish families were only shown homes and given mortgages. They were redlined in red type D neighborhoods. Black families and other households of color were simply not shown homes in Needham. And this was all perfectly legal. Back to you again, Gloria.
So what we could do going forward, first and foremost, is acknowledge the past, learn about it, and stop looking away. I am encouraged that the schools have stepped up and are making a strong effort to incorporate diversity and equity discussions into their history and social studies curricula from the elementaries on up. 8th grade colonial history, led by Steve Mock, has begun incorporating information about enslavement in Needham into their study, and I hope some of his students are listening in on this session today. It is also incumbent upon me and my staff at the History Center to look more closely at the information that we have, and maybe more importantly, the information we don't have, to look more closely and more widely to answer some of these questions, not just about enslavement, but about diversity in general, and what stories are missing from our narratives. To make more of an effort to go past what already lies in our files and collections, to search out those hard-to-find records that provide a more complete picture of Needham's past. Then we need to bring that information forward into public conversations like this one. Just because the history is hard to find or because it is not in the History Center files does not mean that we should not be looking for it. And I'm going to give Reverend Catie the final word.
Thank you, Gloria. My own congregation, First Parish in Needham, Unitarian Universalist, has a racial justice task force and a reparations working group with teams focusing on making changes to Needham public education curriculum, as Dr. Greis has already spoke about, and creating lasting memorials on our congregation's property and in the town. We do not want this history buried again, and public memorials are one way to ensure our enslavement history is not easily forgotten. Our reparations history group is continuing the research on the history of enslavement of Indigenous and African peoples in Needham and Massachusetts more broadly. This spring, our history group is sponsoring monthly reading groups, beginning with a discussion of Elise Lemure's Black Walden on March 7th, an April discussion of Black poets from Phyllis Wheatley to Amanda Gorman, a May discussion on Never Caught about a woman enslaved by President Washington escaping to New Hampshire, and then a June discussion on farming while Black. Our reparations working group welcomes folks from the broader community who wish to collaborate on research, reconciliation, and reparations. You could be in touch with us through uneedham.org, and I believe if she was able to get in, that our member Ellen Fine is going to drop her email address into the chat box. And we're not the only institution or organization in Needham working to uproot systemic racism. The Human Rights Committee, Needham Diversity Initiative, and Progressive Needham have been pushing conversation and policy changes regarding race and equality for many years. Among newer groups, Needham Unite Against Racism Initiative, NUARI, is having important conversations about the presence of white privilege, fragility, and supremacy in our town. The At My Neighbor's Table conversations encourage dialogue between Needham residents about tough issues of privilege and discrimination. And Equal Justice in Needham reminds us that in too many ways, racism happens here. I encourage everyone watching today to look up Equal Justice in Needham's Lived Experiences Project and their Vigil with Marvin Henry to learn more about racial profiling in our town, and to hold March 21st for the next At My Neighbor's Table Zoom dialogue about segregated schools. Like my colleague, Reverend David Petit, I wonder if Needham could support genealogical research to see if we, as a town, can reconcile with the descendants of people enslaved in our town. I wonder what a reparations program would look like out of my own congregation and out of the town. Needham, as a town, would be wise to focus on collective reckoning with its history of enslavement and subsequent racial discrimination. It is a false comfort and false peace to bury our heads to the issues of racism and white supremacy, but such a comfort and peace might be appealing to some. For example, for the last 2 weeks, the Needham Times ran this advertisement you see here for the lecture you've just experienced. And I wonder for all of you, do you notice anything missing from this advertisement? Are you leaning close? They cut out the first half of our title and removed from the description any reference to the history we are actually discussing, which is enslavement. To quote Black, queer, Unitarian Universalist Jabari Jones, the Akan tribe in Ghana have a word, Sankofa, symbolized by a bird with its head turned around to take an egg from its back. The Sankofa heron illustrates a Twi proverb. Translated, it says, "It is no sin to go back and fetch what you have forgotten." In fact, as a minister, I might say that it is a sin to not go back and fetch what has been purposefully buried. Thank you all so much again for your time today, and Dr. Greis and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's been insightful, enlightening, thought-provoking for sure. We have a few questions that have come up. There's one that just wanted to, was Wellesley part of Needham at the time of that you're covering?
Yes, Wellesley didn't separate from Needham until 1881.
Okay.
So for example, Mrs. Sarah Deming, who was one of the folks we highlighted, was actually a resident of West Needham. One thing we might think about partnering with the equivalent of the Needham History Center on the Dedham side is that we were part of Dedham prior to 1711, and so they may actually have. We've done some looking at those records. They may have some information about enslavement history in what is now our town, prior to when our town was founded. And
Thanks to the digitized probate records, which go all the way back to 1736, which is all the way which includes the founding of Dedham, we can actually look at some of those as well.
Okay, great. Another question was, what is an indentured servant?
Indenturing, it's essentially a type of contract, and it covered a range of types of service. It could be, for example, an apprenticeship contract. You were indentured to, say, the blacksmith from usually around the age of 8 or so until you prove You reach adulthood and you prove that you are yourself a competent blacksmith. You produce what was known as a masterpiece to prove that you had mastered your craft, and then you could go out on your own. It could be a penalty for some sort of infraction. Prisons were not as commonplace, transportation or servitude. So it'd be a form of penal servitude. You did something and the law imposed this service on you as your compensation. It could be something much less benign as well. Orphans frequently needed to be cared for by somebody, so they would be contracted out. And this could be a good thing if you were contracted to a person, who was well-meaning and took good care of you, would also teach you a trade. And by the end of this, you come out the other end with a marketable skill, and you would, you would have a life, be set up in life. But it also was a ripe system for abuse, because this person was entirely responsible for you and you had sort of no other recourse. So, so there were a wide range of indenture agreements, but basically they were contracts for labor that provided some form of compensation, either the training or the food and roof over your head or something. And they were also term limited. The contract would end at a specific date.
Okay, great. We have a few more questions here, which is great. The next one is, please clarify or expand on the, quote, triangle trade, enslaved persons, rum, cotton.
The triangle trade was essentially the transportation of rum and other raw materials from the Northeast to the coast of Africa, where they would be traded and used to purchase Africans for enslavement. The Africans would be then transported to the Caribbean and the South as enslaved people, and in payment for them were the raw materials, primarily cotton and sugar and tobacco, that would be brought up to the Northeast for turning into the raw materials would be turned to finished goods, which would then in turn be traded back. So, so basically it was Boston to Africa to the Caribbean and back. Those are the 3 points of the triangle trade, and was a circulation of goods that moved around the raw materials, but also moved around the enslaved people to create them.
Okay. The next one here, there are a lot coming up now, several. Prior to industrialization, were farmers also likely to be enslavers?
There's no reason not, except that it depends really on the level of your property holding. There are a lot of farmers, I look at these probate lists, there are a lot of farmers in Needham whose entire evaluation doesn't go beyond, say, 30 pounds. They basically just own a small amount of land and their home and a couple of livestock, and that's it. There are others where their evaluations in the thousands of pounds. If you have a large piece of land or several pieces of land, and the wherewithal, it was entirely acceptable and probably fairly normal for you to purchase a slave. It was it's a different system from Southern plantation slavery. It's not, there's not that kind of labor intensity, but yeah, farmers, and most people here were farmers.
And that is Gloria, you've already brought up the Royal House, and he was not a farmer, but our geography here in Massachusetts and in New England more broadly did not lend itself to large farming operations, like is seen in the South and Southern plantation systems of enslaved people. So, like we discussed today, really with the exception of the royal family, wealthier New England families who were enslavers, it wasn't like in Southern plantations where there were potentially hundreds of enslaved people. It was maybe one person, two people. Which is why it's remarkable that the Royal House had so many people enslaved there in our region, and it's really a a gift to modern New England that that town and that organization has maintained that home as a particular example of enslavement in our region.
Yeah. And too, in Boston, a lot of enslaved people, worked in shops and yards, loading and unloading freight at the docks, that kind of labor.
And along those lines, given the small number of enslaved people in the area, there is a question about where were they buried? Do we know?
No, we don't. We don't.
Yeah.
There was only a single cemetery in Needham that was determined early on that there would not be they would not permit additional ones. I know I grew up in Connecticut, and you find these little pocket cemeteries. There were several in my neighborhood. That there aren't any in Needham. There's just the main cemetery. Later St. Mary's, but originally just the main cemetery. There is a section of unmarked graves that I've been trying to figure out sort of what the content of those were. The time span is fairly wide, so it's not just formerly enslaved people. There would be other people there, but what the context of this piece of the cemetery is still subject for research. It predates the Cemetery Association's records, so
I see.
It's not that easy. But I would have to think, yes, someplace in the cemetery.
And Gloria, Gloria, I think that
no, go ahead.
I think you had told me that it was common practice at this time period that enslaved people would actually be buried in unmarked graves at the foot of their enslavers. So again, we don't have records of that right now, but we have some starting points where we might look.
So if anybody has ground sensing radar, we can. Subsurface radar, we can go through the cemetery. All sorts of cool stuff to find there.
One other question related to what we're talking about, is how were enslavers viewed by the non-slaving population during this time? There were very few, but they were known, one would guess. So what do you think, given what you've researched, both of you, what would be your guess?
I can say something about Reverend West, who was Reverend Townsend's successor at First Parish, which is to say that Reverend Samuel West began to have abolitionist tendencies, even though he is actually the minister listed in Clark's history as having had baptized two of the enslaved children of Captain Ferris. So by the time that West was in Needham, sentiments were beginning to change in the North around enslavement, but that was also around the time that our state constitution banned it. That would have been during Reverend West's service at First Parish. But there's no indication in the 1750s, which is mostly what we've looked into, that anyone would have looked askance at enslavement. Maybe there would have been some jealousy for having enough money to hold an enslaved person, but not in the kind of, as Dr. Greis already said, Puritan theology. Enslavement fit right along with the primary theology of the town. That it was what was morally, what was the phrase, Gloria? Like morally right?
It was God ordained.
All right.
But I think too, these were prominent people. This was the minister. William Ferris was, he was a bit of a gadfly, but he was also a wealthy man. Jonathan Gay was an officer in the militia. These weren't, they weren't tucked into the corners. These were well-known people. Their houses were right around, what was then the center of town. They were well-known. So there was no social stigma associated with this at the time.
Well,
And
most
actually,
likely.
we still actually have many of those, a few of those historic homes in town. One thing that's interesting, I brought up my congregation's interest in creating public memorials, but neither on the marker at our congregation that that's actually town owned that says Needham's First Church, nor on any of these homes. There's no information about how there were enslaved people living or working in any of these areas. So, but the Tolman Gay House is still around. The Townsend House is still around.
Yeah, I think Ferris's house is actually still, it's now in South Natick, because a little piece of South Natick was once part of Needham. But I think that house is still standing. There are probably a few of them that are still standing.
Yeah.
Okay, so how many slaves were there in Massachusetts when slavery was abolished here? And what became of the slaves that were then free but did not necessarily have income-producing roles in a non-slave economy?
That is something I don't yet know. I haven't looked more broadly at Massachusetts, but in Needham, the other place you see African Americans in the town records are this little cluster right around 1800, 1810, where several people end up in the poorhouse. So they become the responsibility of the town to support them and take care of them, which says to me that they probably had, they probably scraped by in some sort of, performing some sort of labor in the intervening years, but did not do well enough to, save up or have enough to live on. And as they got old, they became destitute and had to be taken care of by the town, which says to me that, essentially once they were emancipated, the door was closed. Okay, you're free, bye. There does seem to be some evidence that William Ferris took care of Phoebe, who was older at that point, and was elderly at the time she came to the poorhouse after his death. But since the date of her arrival and the date of his death pretty much coincide, it looks like he did take care of her, and then his sons did not.
Yeah. No, so
One more question.
Even in the Clark history, there is in that section about slaves on the third page, that he lists these African American residents who essentially were in the poorhouse. In the some of the reading I did on the broader context of Massachusetts enslavement, it was not uncommon in 1783, when slavery was abolished here, that just before that came into effect, that enslavers in Massachusetts would take their enslaved people to Connecticut to sell them, so that they wouldn't have the financial loss. But these are things that we're not, we don't have the records yet to know exactly what happened to the folks who were here in Needham. But it's probably one of these two options, either that they were sold into a state where slavery was still legal, or that they were often cast out.
Well, Clark notes that Ferris, that he sent Jack to England. Ferris had property in England, so he probably sent Jack to England where he could still own him, and he sold Sylvia.
Yeah,
and this is coming up toward that legislation. So he sees the debate, he sees what's coming. It was several years in the making.
Yeah.
So he is monetizing, as it were, monetizing this investment to some extent.
Yeah, and again, that Clark, I think, was much more. We suspect Clark was much more willing to talk about Ferris as a enslaver because he was Anglican, which is Episcopalian, in the United States. Yeah, and not so and a loyalist. So that he was the bad guy. Everyone else was fine.
Yeah, he rats out the two loyalists.
Yes.
So now we're going to move into more kind of trying to link the past with the present. There are a few questions along those lines that folks want to get your opinion on. So first one here is, could the town of Needham consider rent or mortgage subsidies to African Americans as a remedy to past redlining and buyer restrictions? What are your thoughts?
Well, that does seem like more of a question for Mo Handel than for us speaking now. But I mean, certainly there are other towns and cities across the United States who are taking the question of reconciliation and reparations more seriously, or maybe we'd say they're farther along than Needham is, but certainly considering ways that the town can make up for our you can't really make up for enslavement, but to attempt to make up for its history of enslavement and redlining, I think would be very appropriate, and certainly encouraging home ownership in our town would be an excellent way of doing that.
Yeah, I mean, we know that educational inequity and home ownership inequities and other forms of credit difficulties are all part of this long history, and to target equity in those areas would be an important way of providing at least some reconciliation.
And along those lines, another question here is asking, how do we translate our knowledge of the past, what you just shared, what we're learning as a community, into actions for social justice, and I would add equity that is needed today?
I think you would need to, first of all, you need to understand the past, and it's to understand it, to acknowledge it happened, to not. It's very easy for people to say, look, my family came here in 1923 from Italy. They didn't own anybody. They didn't. It's too easy to say this wasn't part of my past. You need to see sort of where you joined the train. That maybe my ancestors were not enslavers in Needham or enslavers in the United States, but they worked their way into a society that they had more privileges because they were white than other people had. They had more educational opportunities than other people had. So you sort of get into that, even if you don't start in that stream, you get into it. And you have to recognize how we got to where we are from where we were. Set that aside to some extent. It happened. It's not going to change. It happened. What are the repercussions now that we can do something about? Where are we empowered? And then to have the strength of mind, but also the strength of heart to say, okay, this is difficult, but we need to move along. We need to move on this. We need to make the changes, even if they're not comfortable, even if they're not easy, even if they're not pleasant.
Yeah, and I very much agree, especially, I think actually, Gloria, both you and I have very similar family stories about coming to America because we're both Italian Americans, aren't we? Yeah. So, and I think about, my grandfather, who came here from Sicily, he and my grandmother, who came here from the Berry region, they experienced racism and discrimination as Italian Americans in the earlier part of the century. But my grandfather was able to access the GI Bill, which Black Americans essentially could not access for education or for housing. They were able to buy a home, able to leave Brooklyn and go out to Long Island with all the other Italians. But that created wealth in the family, that my father and his two siblings were then able to all go to college. And so that you see, this is how white privilege and white supremacy works. So we still benefit from a system set up for to privilege Euro Americans, even if our particular families came here later or experienced discrimination themselves when they first arrived. It's I like what you said about kind of the heart work, having the courage to really face these issues, to know that this history did happen, and that I think about it, even though our ancestors, whether they be direct ancestors or sort of what I would deem spiritual ancestors, like people who lived here before us, or in my case, like Reverend Townsend, even though they didn't do the right thing, doesn't mean that we can't do the right thing now, even if it's difficult.
Thank you. I was going to close here, but there is one last question that just came up, which I think merits your thoughts. Uh, doesn't there have to be an equally honest discussion about the Native Americans who were here before us and how they also were mistreated and had their land stolen? I guess we can all agree that yes, but I would like your thoughts on that.
Unfortunately, there's no monopoly on being poorly treated. Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of tentacles to history. We were on one, but there are other issues that also need to be investigated. Our involvement in them needs to be investigated, and we need to apply the same kind of attention and, I hope, courage to resolving those issues as well.
Well, I'm looking actually, as we're all online right now. So this is, where was this? My congregation, First Parish in Needham, honors what we call History Sunday every November, around the anniversary date of the founding of the town and also the founding of our church. It's that's a whole other conversation about how Massachusetts was founded as a theocracy. But I did preach a sermon on Indigenous peoples, because it was the 400th anniversary of the Plymouth landing this past year in 2020. So I did some initial research, gathering from a bunch of different sources, with a lot of different partners, and I've just posted that in the chat. So if that we certainly have a lot of work to do there as well, particularly because much of the interactions with Indigenous peoples in what is now Needham actually happened when we were Dedham. It's a little more complicated to find out that information, but not impossible. So I do think that we have a reckoning there as well. And I appreciate the kind of national work that was done in 2019 around the 400th anniversary of the first enslaved Africans being brought to the United States through the 1619 Project. And the work of the town of Plymouth and the Wampanoag to really highlight that we were in a 400th anniversary year this past year of the arrival of the Pilgrim settlers. So there's a lot of work to be done around the history of colonization.
South Natick was one of John Eliot's praying Indian communities, and as I said, South Natick was on and off part of Needham until 1789. So it does involve, it was part of our town as well. And that's an extremely complicated issue in itself, and one not to conflate with this. It deserves its own close study.
Yeah, as our own Nahoyden.
There are still people living, who are descendants of that community.
Yes, yeah, the Native Praying Indians, and our own Nahoyden, who's more popularly known in kind of Needham historic lore, worked closely with John Eliot, and there's some really upsetting history around Nahoyden and John Eliot protesting the removal of the praying Indians of South Natick to Deer Island, where many of them died of exposure during King Philip's War, Metacon. Yeah. So there's a lot to work on. But as Dr. Greis said, that really deserves its own lecture, its own research, which hopefully can move forward in the next few years.
And hopefully next time we meet, it will be, we want to kind of do a little, maybe we can learn a little bit more about this particular population. Seems like, there's definitely ground to cover there. So on that note, I want to thank you both, Dr. Greis, Reverend Catie Scudera. Thank you so much for your time with us, for enlightening us, and for helping us connect the dots between the past of Needham with the present and the future, as we all contribute to making Needham a more equitable town.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Please enjoy the beautiful afternoon.
Good night. Good
night.
afternoon. Good afternoon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.